I am good, Joey. I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. We were just chatting, guys. So Sheridan and I have been friends for quite some time now, and we send each other voice chats back and forth all the time, talking about some business stuff. And it feels like, well, we are good friends, and this is the first time we're actually chatting face to face, which is, I guess, the funny thing and the magical thing about social media too, is that you get to meet awesome people. But thank
Yeah.
you for being here today. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks for inviting me. And I think that we originally met with me coming onto Team Violin when you were there at the time, but we'd sort of just missed each other where I was coming and you were leaving. But it's been cool that we've been able to stay in contact since you
Yeah.
left.
Well, we're going to be covering a really important topic today, which is I was going to say the importance of resistance training, but we're not just going to talk about the importance of it, but misconceptions, and we're going to talk about all things related to resistance training during pregnancy, right? That
Yeah.
prenatal period. But before we actually get into the topic, Sheridan, would you mind talking a little bit about your background and your expertise and what you focus on?
Yeah, I always have a lot of trouble with this. I'm like, who am I? What am I doing? Uh,
Existential question: Who am I? Why am I here? What do we do?
what is the meaning of life? Okay, so I originally started in the fitness industry a bit over a decade ago now. So I am not 99 like your question box suggested on my story today, but I am 33. And so I've been in the industry for since I was about 20. And I started on the floor as, just training clients. And I'd always had a keen interest in anatomy, physiology, and science. And I wanted to do medicine at some point. But I kind of found myself in the fitness industry. But after being in it for a while, I was like, I don't know if I'm really helping anyone here. Like, am I really just telling people to not cook in non-stick cookware because they'll get cancer and not to eat after 6 p.m. because they're going to die if they do? And so I felt like I wasn't really making an impact on people positively because I didn't know that there was another way to do it, right? I was 20, I did my normal certifications, which aren't very helpful. And so I decided, okay, well, I'm going to go to uni and study a Bachelor of Nutrition. I wanted to get into nutrition. In my final year of nutrition, I was like, you know what? I still don't think I'm helping anyone. I'm going to go and do nursing. So I did nursing. I did critical care nursing. I worked in the intensive care unit for a while and in the Royal Australian Air Force as a nursing officer. And I did that for a few years before I sort of started seeing a lot of patients that would come in with what I would say are in some degree preventable illnesses, diseases, where they were really unwell. I saw a lot of people, I saw some people lose their lives from from non-traditional evidence-based forms of trying to lose weight, and it was devastating. It was often young women. And I sort of thought, I took a step back and thought, I'm here in these moments with patients who are losing their life, but what if I could be on the other side before they even get here? And that's where I sort of started back into thinking, well, maybe nutrition coaching training could be and bridge that gap. And so I entered back into the industry. I have been doing that since I don't even remember anymore because time just goes by so fast when you are a mum and you have 2 kids. But that kind of led me into here. And next year I will be doing, Australia's a bit different to you guys with their education system, but I'll be doing an honours program, which will hopefully make me eligible for a PhD program in the future. But I've got to get through the honours before I even start using the word PhD.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. How about you touch a little bit on who you work with specifically, because you obviously help women. Well, you talk a lot about resistance training during pregnancy, after pregnancy. So
Yeah.
maybe touch a little bit on that, and then we'll get into the topic.
Yeah, so I work specifically with women. I don't work with men. And I work with women with a variety of different goals, life stages. But I think what I'm probably more so known for right now is my work with pre and postnatal women. And I kind of fell into that because I became pregnant myself, now nearly 6 years ago. And for all the knowledge that I had at the time on training, nutrition, I fell pregnant and it was like I knew nothing. I was so afraid that I was going to do anything to hurt my baby. Everywhere I looked, it was, don't do this, it's bad, you can't do this, it's going to, cause a pregnancy loss. And I was very confused as to how, the day before I was squatting over 200 pounds. And then today my doctor's telling me that I can't lift anything over 25 pounds. And I've always had this curiosity to be like, well, why? Why are we saying that? Where does that come from? What is the evidence that supports that? Because I want to make the best informed decision for myself. And yeah, as soon as I kind of tried to find answers, I was like, there's not really any answers. So I spent the good part of the last 6 years being like, all right, let's try and see what evidence we have and how we can best guide women to continue training in their pregnancies. And yeah, that's how I'm here today.
Yeah, it's such a common thing, right? Specifically with a lot of medical doctors telling women not to pick up anything over 20 or 25 pounds when they're pregnant, which is, at its core, it's an absolutely hilarious thing to say. Because I've experienced it working with female clients as well. One client in particular, and I asked her a very common sense question. She was going through her first pregnancy and her doctor had told her not to lift. And then she was going through her second pregnancy. And she learned during her first pregnancy that she obviously can lift. And during her second pregnancy, doctor told her the same thing, like, don't lift anything heavier than 20 pounds. And she was asking, like, why do they say these things? And I was like, well, did he ever tell you you can't pick up your first kid? And she was like, no, obviously I can pick up my kid. And I was like, does your kid weigh more than 20 pounds? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, you're lifting more than 20 pounds. Like, it's not in the shape of a dumbbell or a barbell, but it's the same exact physiological effect, right? And so maybe we can start this conversation, Sheridan, by touching on what you think are the 3 biggest misconceptions when it comes to resistance training and pregnancy.
Just 3.
You can do more than 3 if you want.
No, we'll go 3 because otherwise we'll be here for 5 hours. The first would be that women cannot lift, quote unquote, heavy during pregnancy. And what defines heavy, we can certainly get into the nuance of that. The second would be that exercise increases the risk of miscarriage. That is a fear that keeps a lot of women out of the gym. And in my opinion, not in my opinion, what we see in the research is that's doing far more harm than good for women and their babies and their pregnancies. And then I would say the third is that exercise is absolutely going to increase your risk of prolapse and abdominal separation or a diastasis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great, and those are all definitely things I've heard as well. Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into each of those and talk about what the evidence actually shows. So let's start with heavy lifting for women during pregnancy. What does the evidence show there?
All right. So before you mentioned, Joey, that your client's doctor had said you can't lift over anything over 20 pounds, and where does that come from? So it comes from some research in an occupational setting. So in the occupational setting, they looked at women who were, working an 8-hour shift. They were repetitively bending, twisting, turning, carrying, awkward objects. And they did find a correlation versus causation, is it chicken or the egg? But they did note that the women who were repetitively lifting in that occupational setting did have some worse pre and postnatal outcomes. And so that was kind of extrapolated to say, well, it was definitely the heavy lifting and it couldn't have possibly been anything else. And that's what people tend to do with research. And what we have to appreciate and understand that, with more so prenatal research is that it is such a protected time, and the consequences of something potentially going wrong is, pretty catastrophic. If I wanted to test whether or not, vegan protein powder was more effective at, building muscle than a whey protein powder, and I asked you, Joey, to come into a lab and I did that, the worst that's going to happen is you're not going to grow muscle in your calves, and that's the worst that can happen, right? So we do have to appreciate that pregnancy is a protected time, and there are very significant considerations we need to make. And so we don't have a lot of high quality evidence in the prenatal space as it pertains to randomized control trials and the meta-analyses and high level evidence. And so what a lot of the recommendations are based on is sometimes situations where it's not even related to pregnancy and they're kind of extrapolating that into pregnancy, or it's based off of expert opinion. And we know that expert opinion isn't the best form of evidence that we can rely on. But it's also, a lot of it is based off of a lot of mechanistic data. So, because this happens, it might mean that this happens. And I think that the best example that I can give in this case, and you can extend on this, Joey, is when we think about, insulin's inability. You can't burn fat if your insulin levels are high because it impairs X, Y, Z. And it's like, that all kind of makes sense when you think of it from a mechanistic point of view. But when you actually translate that into research and real world outcomes, that's not what we see, right? Same with the menstrual cycle. We can have all these, you should be doing this in the luteal phase and this in the follicular phase. But when we test those through real world outcomes, we don't get the same suggestions, right? And so that's where I find it's tricky with pre and postnatal women and, doing the research. But back to kind of that lifting piece, as I mentioned, you can't extrapolate research in an occupational setting to say, well, this is what's going to happen in a 45-minute gym session that is in a controlled environment that you can stop at any point that you want to, and where there is education on awareness of what are the signs that my body is giving me that are suggesting that this is okay, or maybe that it's not okay. And there's a ton of nuance around breathing considerations and what is heavy and what is not heavy. And so I'll welcome you to guide where this goes, because otherwise I'm just going to talk with you for 2 hours and you won't get a word in. But what I will just say is that I think that what you mentioned before, Joey, is amazing, because you were like, well, how much does your toddler weigh? Mm-hmm. And so some of my concerns are these extremely conservative recommendations that are not based off of strong quality evidence, are they just deconditioning women for life, for their activities of daily living? Because, women have to look after maybe other children. They have other jobs. They're going to give birth to their babies where they need to go back into, life. And if we think about when women are having babies in today's day and age, it's generally, in their 30s, right? And where I think we're learning more about the impact of skeletal muscle mass going into perimenopause and the menopausal space, how important it is for women to have that to offset some of the issues we see in the transition through perimenopause and menopause. And so if a woman's having, 1, 2, 3 children, she's breastfeeding in between all of that, she's got the limitations that postnatal women just have in returning to exercise, and we decondition her because maybe this will happen. Yeah. Is there not significant consequences for that? At least I think yes, and we need to do better by women in helping them to feel empowered that this is good for you. And when we look at the statistics of women who don't exercise, who are not pregnant, most of the American country and the Australian population are sedentary. Yeah. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's even higher in prenatal women. But what we know is that in uncomplicated pregnancies, the benefits of exercise far outweigh any potential risks. And so reducing the risks of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, maternal hypertension, which all have really, really profound impacts on not just their pregnancy, but their birth and their postpartum period.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sheridan. And by the way, don't worry about me getting a word in. This episode is all about you. It's not about me at all. You mentioned that some of these recommendations originated from some correlational data in particular occupations. And it's interesting that you brought that up because My mom actually had a miscarriage when I was early 2000s. I was just a kid. And I remember clearly she was a server at the time at a restaurant, and she used to carry these big trays full of heavy plates. And she had a miscarriage, and they clearly told her it was because she was lifting heavy stuff at work. I now know that's probably not the root cause, but it's tough, right? Because if you go through an experience like that and your doctor is like, it's because you did this one thing, it's scary, and you're probably going to trust it to a certain extent, right? But like you mentioned, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Maybe she was going to have that happen independent of what she was doing. Who knows, right?
Yes.
You
Well,
mentioned-
we kind of know in the research when we're looking at miscarriage that exercise is not a risk factor for miscarriage. We have, meta-analyses and systematic reviews showing this. And that's the highest level evidence that we can have, right? It's when we're looking at miscarriage, it's so unfortunate that, at least in Australian statistics, that 1 in 4 women will experience a miscarriage at some point in their lifetime. And when we look at mostly the reason for miscarriages, it is because there was genetic abnormalities within the baby, and that sometimes those abnormalities cannot be compatible with life, right? And so most miscarriages are happening in the first trimester when all of those, the baby is being formed, and the brain and the nervous system and everything's happening. And I think it's incredibly sad that women are told that it was because you were working for your family or for whatever, and you were standing on your feet and you were doing normal life things, and it's your fault. You did this. And that is just absolutely devastating, because we do not have any evidence to suggest that is the truth. And women blame themselves so much already for so many things. And then they become scared to do anything, to cough, to sneeze, to move, to work. And we have to imagine the flow-on effect that has from, their finances to their relationships to their mental health. It's complex.
Yeah. Being a man, I've never even thought about that aspect of it, but it makes complete sense. The feeling of guilt, right? That it's your fault. And so if you do get pregnant again, you're going to be walking on eggshells, essentially thinking you can't do anything, which obviously is not the most healthy mindset, and it can have obviously negative impacts on overall lifestyle as well. You had mentioned that for obvious reasons, there isn't super strong evidence or a ton of really controlled research in the prenatal period, because it is a protective time for women. That said, we can attack that point of view from the opposite, or I should say we could attack that topic from the opposite point of view, in the sense that, is there any evidence to suggest that resistance training is dangerous for women during pregnancy?
I love that. I love talking to people with PhDs, because they ask the good questions, like, oh yeah, we don't have evidence of this, but what about that? So great question. When we're looking at medically uncomplicated pregnancies, and what I mean by that is there are some specific conditions that women can develop throughout pregnancy that make exercise contraindicated. So what that basically means is the potential benefits of exercise there's more risk to that person exercising than not exercising, right? So I kind of spoke about exercise reducing risks of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes. If a woman already has preeclampsia and it's uncontrolled and she's having a lot of complications from it, exercising isn't going to add to that benefit. It's about, protecting the baby and making sure that she gets through as much of her pregnancy as possible and being treated. So there are certain circumstances where, exercise isn't recommended. Now, we have to define what exercise is, because for a long time, women were put on bed rest and said, you can't move and do anything because we don't want to do anything to this pregnancy. And what we're finding more and more in the research is that bed rest probably has worse outcomes for her pregnancy, for the baby, for her postpartum period. But there might be a period of pelvic rest, meaning that we're not going to do anything that's like creating a lot of exertion. You're going to go about your activities of daily living as per usual. And so, yes, there are certain circumstances that you shouldn't be exercising, right? But these are the minority, and it's important that you know if you have these conditions, and your doctors will tell you that you have these conditions. But in all other pregnancies that are not complicated, we do not have evidence to say that exercise is bad for the pregnancy. We have a ton of evidence showing that it is positive and beneficial for the pregnancy. So I mentioned again the reduced risk of gestational diabetes, etc. But we also know that women who go throughout pregnancy and they don't resistance train, they don't exercise, while they might experience some of the aches and pains that pregnant women do with a body that is changing rapidly, like low back pain, like pelvic girdle pain, for example, they don't experience as high level a pain as a woman who exercises, right? And we also see that women just recover a lot better when they have stayed active throughout their pregnancies as well. If we look at it from a mental health standpoint, we see positive associations with mental health, self-esteem, body image in women who do exercise compared to women who don't. So to answer your question, we have a ton of evidence to show that exercise is beneficial. And if you look at the Australian guidelines and the Canadian guidelines, which are two countries that do have a very detailed evidence-based breakdown of what the recommended amount of exercise is in pregnancy, they are both in agreement that resistance training, cardiovascular activities, regular walking, and reducing the amount of time that you are sedentary are recommended. And the movement that is recommended for pre- and postnatal women are actually not different to the general population. It's the same.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And before we move on to the next topic, because I really want to clarify this, because I feel like to you and I, it's obvious, but when the listener is listening, I feel like they may have some questions about this, because you're mentioning that there's no evidence that exercise is harmful for non-complicated pregnancies, and there's actually a ton of positive health benefits. I'm assuming we can say that for resistance training specifically as well, correct?
Yes. So transparently, if we look at the amount of data we have on exercise just as a whole, there is way more data on cardiovascular training. There is not a ton when it comes to resistance training. So from the last time that I've looked, I think that there was about 3 randomized controlled trials, 3 on resistance training in pregnancy. And even when you look at, if we look at what were the loads used in those studies, because that matters, right? We can have a 1 kilo dumbbell or a woman with a 100 kilo squat. That is very, very different. And so even the randomized controlled trials that we have, they're very, very conservative. Some of them were using only a couple of kilos. Some of them were using 40% of a 1 rep max. That's not what we see women doing in the gym today. It depends on the women, but some are still powerlifting. Some people are still competing in competitive sports. There was a woman who was in the Olympics pregnant, and she competed pregnant. The landscape of women's sports and how many female athletes we're seeing today is so different to 30 years ago. And so there's such a bigger need for that. So what we're kind of seeing from a resistance training standpoint is, although we don't have randomized controlled trials and we don't have higher quality evidence, we have the anecdotal experience of women who are kind of, let's say, quote unquote, pushing boundaries. And by that, I mean, they're just exercising the way that they previously did. And we have, there's a really great survey that was done by Dr. Christina Prevet, who looked at, I think it was over 500, it was about 500 to 600 women. And what the survey was kind of gathering is women who were training at 80% of their 1 rep max, which is generally not recommended when you look at the intensity guidelines in pregnancy. They were training in the supine position, so they were training on their back. They were doing high intensity training. They were breath holding, which if you go to every pre and postnatal course, it's like, oh, never hold your breath. It's absolutely, you will combust. It's awful. And they wanted to basically look at, do these women have worse pelvic floor outcomes than women who are not training this way? And they found typical pelvic floor outcomes to the women who were doing those things and then women who didn't, right? There was actually a slight benefit to the women who were at higher intensities, and by intensities, I don't mean huffing and puffing, but relative to their load, in close proximity to failure, essentially. And so that's kind of led to, okay, well, now that we have this, and you would appreciate this, Joey, once you have a little bit of evidence, it makes getting approval for other higher forms of evidence easier, because it's like, well, we have this, and ethics committees, et cetera, are more like, okay, well, if you have this, then let's try this. And so it's an exciting time for resistance training specifically, but yes, not as much evidence from a resistance training standpoint.
Yeah, it's almost like women who are pregnant can just live their lives and they're not super fragile.
I know. So crazy, right? And I don't love relying on like survivorship bias to be like, well, women have been pregnant for thousands of years and they've been fine. Because it's like, well, if you look at mortality rates 100 years ago, they weren't that great. But yes. And I think that the most fascinating thing for me is like we're in this period of time where it's like girl power, right? Like feminism, and we are strong and we can do things, and you know your body and all of these things. But, oh, you're pregnant? Oh, no, you don't know your body. Like, just ignore everything that you've ever known about your body and your intuition and all of these things. And that flows on to postpartum. Intuition, mother's intuition, no, don't trust that. Trust Google. Trust all the, the opinions of everybody else. And it's the irony.
Yeah. My wife during her first pregnancy stayed super active the entire time without like looking into many recommendations or anything like that. Literally just listened to how her body felt, quite literally. And we're 4 weeks away from having our second baby now, and she's been super active the whole time. And like this morning she was doing yard work and raking leaves and just like huffing and puffing outside. And I was just reflecting on what you were talking about earlier about like typical experiences during pregnancy and typical pains and typical discomforts. And I'm not going to say it's because she's been so active, but she hasn't had any of that. Literally, like very minimal. Like her feet are swollen. She asked me to massage them at night, like pretty normal stuff, because she's on her feet all day. And if she's on her back for a long time, her back starts to hurt because she has a huge belly. But besides that, like minimal complications, right? And I'm not going to say it's because of the exercise, but I really do think it obviously plays a very important role, right? I want to, I was going to say, Sheridan, I want to transition the question to, or the next topic to talk about the health benefits of exercise, which you've touched on a little bit for both women, for both mom and the baby. But I want to finish off this first topic about 3 myths with the second 2 myths. And just a quick point there, is there any evidence to suggest that resistance training is, and we already touched on this one, but increases the risk of miscarriage or increases the risk of abdominal separation? Because I know that's a big fear for women as well.
So we kind of touched on the miscarriage point, and we can elaborate on that. But I think that the best thing that I just want to let women know is you are not doing anything wrong. You are safe. You are doing great things for you and your baby by staying active. And if if you have experienced a loss or you do experience a loss, it was not your fault. And I'm so sorry that happened, but it wasn't because of anything that you did, and there was nothing that you could do to prevent that. So just know that, and that, you're safe in exercising. And the second part was diastasis?
Yep, correct.
Yep. Okay, so I kind of want to piggyback this off of the first myth, which is like heavy resistance training, right? Is that okay if I kind of piggyback that off there?
Yeah, of course.
It's relevant. So if we are thinking about resistance training specifically because, I work with women who before pregnancy, they generally have aesthetic-based goals, they have athletic-based goals, and maintaining and growing muscle mass are two very important elements of those things that I do with my clients. If we're looking at resistance training, we have to consider, okay, what could potentially be the problem with heavy, quote unquote, lifting in pregnancy? And so I first want to define what is heavy lifting, because what is heavy lifting? If your client says to you, Joey, how heavy can I lift? Or how heavy do you want me to lift? What's generally your answer to that client?
Hey guys, some of you may not know that I'm the scientific advisor for a supplement company called Outwork Nutrition. I help with the formulation of new products to help ensure that they're effective and backed by science. Unlike many other supplement companies out there, we don't rely on exaggerated claims or flashy marketing tactics. Instead, we let the science speak for itself. We take pride in formulating products that deliver real results, helping you achieve your fitness goals in a meaningful way. If you're in the market for supplements like protein powder, pre-workout, or recovery products, make sure to check us out at outworknutrition.com. And as a thank you for being an avid listener of this podcast, use code Joey for an exclusive discount at checkout. You can find the link to our website down in the description of this podcast episode. Remember, our goal is to empower you with science-backed supplements that truly make a difference. Choose Outwork Nutrition and elevate your fitness to new heights. It's relative to what you can lift at the moment, right?
Yes.
So we would work within a particular rep range and look at intensity relative to like RIR or something like that, right? Yes. So I would say heavy is relative to how hard you have to exert yourself to lift a particular weight, but that's different for everyone.
Yes, exactly. So it depends, right? Heavy is relative. The way that I like to define heavy for a prenatal client is in what is the proximity to not so much failure that you get to, but there's going to be a moment where you notice that in order to continue lifting a weight, you have to hold your breath. And so people don't notice that they do this, Joey. They don't notice that when they're reaching proximity to failure, they will naturally hold their breath. Take a deep breath in, hold their breath, because that is what humans do to stabilize their spine under load. That's called that Valsalva breath. Now, it's interesting because we have this idea in like all the pre and postnatal courses that you'll do. If you go on TikTok, whatever, it's like do not ever breath hold, because breath holding makes your pelvic floor worse. It makes your abdominal separation worse. To clarify, we do not have evidence to suggest that that is the case. That is purely based off of expert opinion and mechanistic ways of thinking, right? And the idea is, well, if you've already got a system that's under pressure, your core and your pelvic floor, because it's growing a baby, it's growing a whole new organ, it's required to carry more load, then why would you want to stress that out? I want to play devil's advocate here, Joey, and I want to, let's say that you said to me, you were a painter and you used your right hand all day to just paint walls. And you said, you know what, I really just want to strengthen my shoulders, my rotator cuff, my back muscles, because that's really going to support what I do in my work. And I said, Joey, you can't strengthen a muscle that's already under so much strain. No. You want to rest it, not do anything with it, decondition it, and I promise it'll make it better. It doesn't
make any sense.
It's stupid. It's like if a system is required to do more, we need to strengthen that system, right? And so we want women to be training at higher intensities, but it's relative, right? Going back to the breath holding piece, if you tell a woman never, ever to breath hold in her pregnancy, she will be deconditioning herself, because she's basically, an RIR of 1 or RP of 9. you can't get there without holding your breath, because that's exertion and that's what we naturally do. So you're kind of bringing her back to, an RPE 4-5 where she can free breathe, but she's not able to stabilize her spine under load. Does that make sense? You're automatically like deconditioning her just by saying you can't breath hold, right? And so if we're saying that breath holding makes pelvic floor and core outcomes worse, we don't have any evidence to suggest that at all, but we're also purposely deconditioning that woman as well with doing that. And so if we look at intensity, what I always say to clients is you want to choose an intensity that matches the breath strategy that you're going to choose. So going back to what could potentially go wrong with higher loads or higher intensities is that when women breath hold, there's two elements. There's the element of, does it affect the baby? Because when we breath hold and we apply a Valsalva breath, it changes our hemodynamics, because we're essentially holding our breath under a closed glottis. We're increasing the pressure within our core canister and also our lungs, and that creates changes hemodynamically. So how your heart pumps, how many times it pumps, what happens with your blood pressure. You'll see it go up, you'll see it go down. And so the question is, does that lead to poor outcomes for specifically a baby? And so we've had some evidence that has shown that when women do hold their breath, there are changes that happen within the baby. So they noted like a bradycardia, for example, so heart rate declined in baby. And so that was kind of extrapolated again, say bad, there was a change, but it didn't measure the outcomes. Like, yes, they observed the transient change in heart rate, but what did that mean for the outcomes, right? They didn't extend on that. But we have more recent evidence to show that when that happens, yes, there's that transient decrease in the baby's heart rate, but that doesn't lead to poorer outcomes. It just means that there was that transient change in the baby, right? Then you have to think of it from what could happen to mum. And so the main concerns are, okay, well, is she going to make abdominal separation worse? Is she going to make her pelvic floor worse? The short answer to that is no, we don't have evidence to suggest that. But we do need to be mindful of how, like, the role that coaches play here, right? So I think that what's a better question is, does the woman understand the sensations that she's supposed to feel throughout pregnancy, her training? How does she know that that sensation is normal? And how does she know that it's a sensation that perhaps needs follow-up with her doctor, that she should stop exercising? And so we kind of just take that away from women and say, don't try and understand any of the sensations, right? Now, I'm trying to get this all out without a massive TED talk. The way that I approach my clients is I give them breath strategies, okay? Sure. Because holding your breath is not the only way to do things. There are other forms that you can choose, right? I'll go through them first, and then I will discuss kind of my reservations about always choosing a different breath strategy. So if you're going to apply a Valsalva breath, one of the things that you have to come to accept is that I cannot show you a randomized control trial to say that it's absolutely 1000% safe. Sure. I can show you evidence that suggests that it's probably okay. And women have to then say, well, I have my own risk tolerance. I know what I know, and I'm able to make the best informed decision for myself. It's not black and white, right? And so some women are comfortable. Yep, I'm comfortable with the evidence. I'm going to go with doing that, right? For women who are maybe more apprehensive or have a lower risk tolerance, another way that you can go through your training is something called a free breathing strategy. Exhaling on exertion. So what that means is that when you're going through the concentric, the hardest part of any movement, you're going to take an exhale breath. And let me just break down what that might mean tangibly, say in a back squat, for example. What you're going to do is when you're at the top of the squat, the bar is on your back, you're going to take a breath in. You're going to allow the pelvic floor to relax. You're not going to contract it the same way you would under a breath hold. And then when you reach the bottom of the squat, you're going to take a breath out and you're going to contract the pelvic floor up. So breathe in on the eccentric, allow pelvic floor to relax. Breathe out on the concentric, contract the pelvic floor. Where the idea of that comes from, Joey, is that there's this mechanistic understanding that the diaphragm or the pelvic floor follows what the diaphragm is doing. So when we take a breath in, our diaphragm contracts down because that's generally going to increase the pressure within that core canister. What might happen is the pelvic floor also follows that. So it naturally wants to move down as the diaphragm moves down. When you take the breath out, diaphragm contracts up. And so the idea is that you give your pelvic floor a bit of a kickstart when it's naturally coming up through that contraction. And that might support you better. Then there's free breathing. You're naturally just going to breathe as you normally do. You're not going to try and coordinate it. You're going to just breathe in, breathe out continuously, not hold your breath. The more you move down those options, so a breath hold, exhaling on exertion, and free breathing, the lower your intensity is going to get. Because if I asked you to do a hack squat and I asked you not to hold your breath, you're not going to be able to push, right? And so there's that element of that. My concern with that is that it makes the assumption that women will never, ever, ever breath hold in their life. And I promise you that they do, right? Have you watched your wife try and get out of a deep chair?
Yeah, of course. You hold your breath when you do that. You hold your breath when you're taking a shower and you put your head under the water. It's probably not the same in the sense of like you're not really contracting the pelvic floor the same way. But to answer your question directly, yes.
Yeah. So I want you to imagine her heavily pregnant, trying to get out of bed or trying to get out of a deep chair. Is it a hard thing for her?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Even to roll around in bed. Yes.
Yes, exactly. So she's reaching exertion when she's doing that because it's hard to do that, right? And so she's naturally holding her breath. So if you don't teach people what they're supposed to feel in a breath hold, how do they go about their activities of daily living? Make sense?
Of course.
Yeah. Now, the other element is, what is the problem with the mum, if anything? If we look at diastasis recti, we know that it is a natural progression of pregnancy. Your body has to adapt. It's actually incredible that our bodies can do this to allow the baby to grow. It needs to separate, or I prefer the word elongate, to simply allow things to move. Now, when we look at risk factors of diastasis, so for clarity, 100% of women will have some degree of abdominal separation in their pregnancies. Mm-hmm. It has to happen. Can some women experience, when I say high degrees of abdominal separations, meaning that they come apart, like the two rectus muscles come further apart? Yes, they can. But we mostly see that genetics play a big role in this. Potentially BMI plays a big role in this. The size of your baby plays a big role of this. And if you have any kind of conditions that make you generally hypermobile. When we look at risk factors, exercise is not a great risk factor for it. And we have no evidence that suggests that any exercise makes it worse, right? But women are very fearful of it. And if they think they have an abdominal separation or they see abdominal coning, they freak out. They think they're doing something wrong. And that's because we instill the fear of God into them, that if they see coning, they're ruining their abdominal separation. No evidence that this is true. Do I suggest coaching away from abdominal doming? So for clarity, abdominal doming is like when a woman takes a breath in and you're going to see that protrusion of the midline, like between the two rectus muscles. Mm-hmm. If you can kind of visualize that. It does not mean that she's making it worse, but it does mean that the core canister is having trouble contracting evenly to distribute pressure well, right? And so it kind of comes out the midline. It's a weak position. So you kind of don't want to be coaching people in a weak position. It'd be like asking them to do the ugliest Romanian deadlift you've ever seen and not trying to correct that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more of a movement fault, not a pathological fault. That doesn't make it worse, if that helps to understand that. The other element is, and finally, I'll let you get the next word in, is pelvic organ prolapse and the pelvic floor. So again, when we look at the risk factors of pelvic organ prolapse, exercise is not a major risk factor for pelvic organ prolapse. It, again, comes down to genetics. Age plays a really big part in this. Potentially BMI, again, plays a big role in this. But also how many children you've had. If you've had previous vaginal deliveries, you're going to be at higher risk than women who have had cesarean deliveries. But it's also straining on your pelvic floor. So straining, you can strain on a pelvic floor, you can contract on a pelvic floor. When we think of straining, it's comparable to when humans have a bowel motion. We drop the pelvic floor because that's what has to happen for us to have a bowel motion, right? And so if you're constantly straining and dropping and opening that pelvic floor, potentially you're going to experience more symptoms. Potentially you're just going to notice weird sensations. And constipation and straining is a higher risk factor for pelvic organ prolapse as well. What does that mean? It comes down to coaching cues and helping women to understand, what does a pelvic floor contraction feel like? What does drop and opening feel like? What does straining feel like? And do you notice that in your training? We had a very, very old study. I think it was like 1999, where they looked at women who were exercising, and they noticed that above 50% of those women tend to bear down on their pelvic floor. So it's a coaching cue. It's a coaching thing, right? So to answer your question directly, Joey, no, we do not have any evidence that exercise makes a diastasis worse, pelvic floor dysfunction worse. It's all contextual.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing the details, because it's easy for you to just say, no, it doesn't. But without the context, it may be difficult for people who are listening to maybe even trust what you're saying without sharing some of the evidence, right? So I really appreciate the context there. You mentioned earlier, or lightly discussed, some of the health benefits of exercise for women during pregnancy and why they should be exercising, right? Reduced risk of gestational diabetes, high blood pressure complications, obviously a whole host of health benefits there. I would like if we maybe just take a couple minutes to really highlight what are the main health benefits that women can experience from lifting weights during pregnancy. Like, what is the biggest argument as to why women should be lifting weights during pregnancy? If you want to touch on maybe some of the mechanisms as to how things are improved, that would be great. And then if you could highlight what health benefits, if any, are there for mom to exercise for the baby?
Oh, God, where do I even start this? Where do I even start it?
Let's talk about health benefits for mom and then health benefits for baby.
Yeah. So I've touched on the preeclampsia element. So preeclampsia is going to be, for both mom and baby, preeclampsia is definitely a complication of pregnancy that can really risk both mum's life and baby's life, which is why if women have it, it's taken very seriously. And that is, their birth and how they birth is considered in managing that. So I have some women who develop preeclampsia throughout their pregnancy as clients, and it becomes a contraindication to them exercising. And so if there is anything that we can do to reduce the odds of preeclampsia, that is beneficial for both mum and baby. From a gestational diabetes standpoint, pregnancy naturally makes, like, the demand for the mother's body to produce more insulin to manage blood sugar levels goes up, because there's some changes with the placenta, and there can be a higher level of insulin resistance, even in healthy women. I think that when we look at diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes, it's like, oh, it's a problem it's a lifestyle issue. You were lazy, you gained too much weight, and that can carry on to gestational diabetes. But women who are fit, healthy, and all of the things can potentially develop gestational diabetes. But again, exercise reduces the risk of gestational diabetes, and it certainly makes everyone, not just pregnant women, more insulin sensitive, right? You're able to better utilize insulin to bring blood sugars down. And so there's that element. If there's an element specifically for the mother, it's improvements in mental health. There are potentially, I think, and don't quote me on this, I won't die on this hill, but I think there was a systematic review that showed that exercise throughout pregnancy decreased rates of depression. I think it was in pregnancy. It might have been postpartum, but I'm pretty sure it was in pregnancy.
Well, we know that there's a correlation there in non-pregnant individuals as well. So I wouldn't be surprised that carries through pregnancy and postnatal as well.
Yeah, I think from memory, because I thought that too. And I think from memory, I'd have to go back to this, that there was, I'm pretty sure the association was in pregnancy, but not so much the early postpartum period, but I could be really wrong about that. But yes, you're right. There's just that correlation in general that it improves depression. So there's that element. You could argue that's also a benefit to the baby, because people who experience mental health issues, that the baby's going to be impacted by some way, shape, or form with that, right? Now, one thing I will say is that being fit and active in pregnancy doesn't guarantee you a specific birth outcome. You are not guaranteed to have a faster, easier birth without any complications, without any interventions like forceps or suctioning or a cesarean. And I think that that's a very important distinction, because again, if a woman has the idea that she wants a natural vaginal birth and she ends up needing an emergency cesarean or an epidural or whatever the case is, she places a lot of blame on herself for that, right? And so birth is very unpredictable, and the best birth for you is the one that gets you and your baby here as safely and healthily as possible. But it does improve your postnatal recovery. It does reduce the aches and pains that you experience throughout your pregnancy. And so I think that those are the main things from a pre and postnatal standpoint that I want to highlight, Joey. But I do just want to, again, go back to thinking about skeletal muscle mass across the female lifespan and how important and integral it is for health, for longevity, for women to be here for as long as they can, to see their kids grow up. Like, that's all I want. I just want to be here for as much of my children's life, to see every bit that I can see of their one true beautiful life. And so I protect my skeletal muscle mass I'm like, nope, like that's the most important thing to me, right? And if we are purposely deconditioning women in pregnancy, and you bring a baby into the world and then say to them, oh, it's going to be so much easier when the baby gets here, you'll have plenty of time. Lies. Women do not have plenty of time when they're caring for a human. The postpartum period increases. Like, there's so many barriers and resistance to returning to exercise postpartum. If we look at pregnancy, it's one of the greatest risk factors for obesity in women. The more babies that women have, the higher that risk of obesity increases. And women who don't lose or return to their, and I say this with reluctance, and just give me a chance to finish this sentence. There's some data to suggest that women who don't return to their pre-pregnancy weight, again, there's some nuance in that because weight is not everything, may not return to that pre-pregnancy weight. And they can, in some data, it shows that with each subsequent pregnancy, women gain more and more weight or hold and retain more postpartum body fat, right? And that's where that risk of obesity comes from. Because why? I think it's a multifactorial conversation.
Sure.
Being through 2 postpartum periods myself, I can say that it felt impossible to get to the gym with my second baby. And I was drowning, and it was hard, and I was exhausted, and there was just so many barriers to returning to exercise. And I'm a coach. I know all the things to do, but it was so immensely hard, right? But if you remove that from them in pregnancy, and then you tell them that it's going to be easier postpartum, I don't think that's fair. And so you want to keep habits in place as much as you possibly can. It may not look the way it did pre-pregnancy, but you got to do what you can during pregnancy to keep that momentum and to just make it a lot easier for yourself in the postpartum period to be, eating well, to be naturally moving, because that only gets harder in the postpartum period. So to wrap up, protecting the skeletal muscle mass of women across the female lifespan, across the decade where they are going to have the most amount of barriers to fitness, healthy eating that any woman's going to have at any time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sheridan. And quick nerdy moment, because we were talking about gestational diabetes and increase in insulin resistance during pregnancy. So the theory behind that is that it naturally occurs so that we can have greater nutrient delivery for the baby, essentially, right? Because if your body isn't uptaking the blood sugar, then that can be delivered to the baby for for growth purposes, obviously. So it's cool the way like physiology changes to prioritize different things. That's
100%.
That's all I wanted to share there.
Your body,
that's all I could think about when you were talking about that.
The female body, it's like, what does the baby need? How do I just get it to the baby, right? And so just very, very briefly touching on that, Joey, because I think it's such a good point. Bone mineral density changes a lot in pregnancy. It decreases. Postpartum, it decreases. Again, when we look at sarcopenia and osteoporosis and transitioning to perimenopause and menopause and changes in estrogen, it's just such a flow-on effect, right? And so in the postpartum period, because your body has done everything to deliver the nutrients that your baby needs to the baby, you're probably depleted in a lot of really essential vitamins and minerals. Again, if you choose to breastfeed, breastfeeding it's honestly I'm fascinated by it because it's literally just created from the woman's blood. A lot of people think that it's like the milk is just the milk, but it's taken from the woman's body. What resources does the woman have? What does the baby need? And I'm going to give those resources to the baby. So again, if you're breastfeeding, you're probably going to be depleted in a lot of vitamins, minerals. What is my point? I mentioned that women who don't lose weight within the first 12 months postpartum are more likely to carry it ongoing. But please, for the love of God, do not pressure yourself into dieting for at least 4 months postpartum. At least, really focus on how do I just increase my lean body mass again? So resistance training, getting that bone mineral density up, consuming sufficient calories, making sure that I'm supplementing appropriately if I'm not getting everything that I need. A platform I love for my clients is Chronometer. So it's a tracking platform where it also looks at their micronutrients. And so women can jump on there and maybe just track 1 or 2 days of their intake to see, am I meeting my needs? Do I need to be covered with a supplement? And just considering that sleep deprivation, which we all have postpartum, increases the loss of lean body tissue. So just dieting is going to make that even worse. And so give yourself at least 4 months of just settling in before you even consider any kind of aesthetic-based fat loss goal.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. And to wrap this up, I want to ask one last question. And I'm sure we could probably record another hour on just this question.
I'll try.
But let's talk about just practical recommendations, easy implementable things. What are some perhaps, I guess we touched a little bit on safety considerations of lifting during pregnancy, but maybe we can touch on some practical modifications that women can make to their resistance training during pregnancy, maybe in particularly during that 7th, 8th, 9th month, right? Because that's where my wife pretty much was able to lift the exact same the first 6 months, and then started implementing some modifications towards the end, because obviously all of the difficulties that come with having a bigger belly and being more out of breath, right? So what are some modifications that can be made there?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try. I'll do my best, because I freaking love this question.
And we can honestly probably do a follow-up episode on like practical training tips during pregnancy as well. But let's maybe start the conversation with this final question.
For sure. Okay. So I want everyone who listens to this podcast, if you're listening to it and being like, I'm still not 100% clear on what I can and cannot do, I want you to remove all of the, can I do this? Is this safe? Is this not safe? I hate the word safe in pregnancy, because using it implies that there is something unsafe that you can do. We do not have any evidence that any exercise, from a resistance training standpoint, I'm not talking about skydiving out of an aeroplane. Let's use some common sense here, but it's not harmful or unsafe for your baby. Whatever exercise you are doing, whatever modality of exercise you are doing, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Do I experience an increase in Braxton Hicks contractions? So those are like those false labor contractions. Does this mean that something bad is happening? No, but it might just mean that you need to just pull back the intensity a little bit to see if those Braxton Hicks contractions decrease. That's probably going to be more so in trimester 3 when you do experience those. But it might just be a sign that you're pushing that intensity a little bit too much. Do you experience heaviness of the pelvic floor in your movements and after your movements? So heaviness, I want you to take it with a grain of salt, but be aware of it, right? Because if I asked you to jump on a leg extension and do 10 sets to failure, how would your legs feel that day and the next day?
Really bad.
Really
extreme pain, extreme soreness.
Yes. So this is what we underappreciate about the pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor is always working, always. It supports you through your activities of daily living, right? And so it's a collection of muscles. Muscles get fatigued. They get tired when it's asked to do more work. And so if you're doing a squat, an RDL, a leg extension, a leg curl, or whatever you're doing throughout your training, you may not be directly training your glutes in every one of those exercises, but you are training your pelvic floor. And so women, your glutes are strong, your quads are strong, your arms are strong, your legs are strong. Your pelvic floor is this thing that we need to be considering when it comes to progressively overloading and how much intensity we're able to handle. Don't ask what intensity can my glutes handle, ask what intensity can my pelvic floor handle. Does that make sense, Joey?
Yeah, I like that reframing for sure.
Yeah. So heaviness might indicate that your pelvic floor just had to work hard. If that heaviness is problematic, it causes you symptoms that feel problematic, then maybe you want to decrease your intensity and see if that helps. The other thing is leaking. Do you experience leaking in your training? Again, take it with a grain of salt in late trimester 3, because sometimes leaking is going to occur even if you're doing all the right things. But if you're having an increase in leaking or it's becoming problematic, you might need to just bring back your training intensity. What is the other thing? There is one more thing. And just being mindful of heat. So, we want to make sure that we're not overheating. You don't need to monitor your heart rate in pregnancy, but overheating is something that you want to keep an eye out for. Now, for specific modifications, it doesn't matter what trimester you're in. If something feels off, modify it. If you notice abdominal coning, for example, you don't need to necessarily remove it, be fearful of it. It might be in a lat pull down, for example. You might be like, I'm going to try a different breath strategy to see if that helps. I'm going to try and limit my range of motion. I might go to a single arm variation because generally that's going to make a big difference. If you're experiencing pelvic pain, you might be like, okay, explosive unilateral movements are not going to be comfortable. Go to a stationary. Use your judgment. Does it feel okay? If it doesn't necessarily mean I need to stop. I just might try a different variation and see if that helps, and just keep doing that throughout your pregnancy. So some people will be like, After trimester 1, you can't do crunches. Lies, lies. After trimester 1, you can't do planks. Lies. Show me where the evidence points to that. Like, why? Why are we making these blanket recommendations? So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. The biggest change my wife made during late pregnancy was just switching from like free weight compound movements to more machine-based isolation movements because of comfort, right? It was like hard to squat and her center of gravity was off and she couldn't do pull-ups anymore and stuff like that. So she still trained hard, just started doing more like leg extensions and leg curls and little things like that, which I guess was what I was thinking in the sense of like, hey, at some point, I mean, if you can barbell squat all 9 months, awesome. I'm sure at some point it probably starts feeling really uncomfortable, and there's nothing wrong with switching that for a leg press or a leg extension, as long as you can still keep those muscles working, right?
So what she kind of did was she took a movement that didn't have a lot of stability and required a lot of core stability, and she kind of removed that need for the core stability by going to machine work. So I think that's awesome. It's like if you're starting with a back squat, it's not feeling good, go to a Smith machine squat. If that's not feeling good, go to a leg press, just exactly like Joey said. So we're kind of thinking, how do I just increase the stability of the machine so my body doesn't have to do as much of that stabilizing through the core?
Exactly. Awesome, Sheridan. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom with my audience. Do you mind sharing where they can find you and how they can connect with you afterwards if they so desire?
Yeah, so I'm just mostly active on Instagram. That's it. I do try TikTok. I feel too old for that. I don't know how to figure it out. Instagram. So Sheridan Skye, SKYE Fit. That's mostly where I run out of.
Yeah, and do you mind sharing your website as well?
Oh, under construction.
Okay.
But it will be thefemalefitnessformula.com.au. But just go to Instagram because we're rebranding and doing a few things behind the scenes. So that's, under construction.
Okay, great. Yeah, all links, guys, will be down in the description as always. In Sheridan, whenever it's not under construction anymore, let me know. We'll update the episode and put the link there as well. As always, guys, if you listened to the entire episode, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this episode valuable. Thank you so much for always supporting the podcast. As always, if you're a regular listener and you enjoy the content I put out, just take a second to rate the podcast and leave a review. It really does help me a ton. And I'll catch you in next week's episode. Bye.